Well, I've been following your music for some years now. I think the first time I heard you was with Sean Wayland.
Oh
There's some
yeah,
yeah, there's some videos on YouTube where you guys are playing trio, and there's
awesome.
also some other music that I found out with you playing, practicing at home,
Yeah.
showing some demos that you made with the Prophet and with the TX7.
Hmm.
And to me, there were two things that really stood out and actually blew my mind. Um, the first one is I've yet to encounter such a player like you with so much technical flow on the Iwi.
Oh, hey,
Um, I don't know anyone, again, from my perspective, from the way that I view it, I don't know anyone who can play with such flow the way you do.
wow.
So,
Thank you.
so that's something I'm curious to kind of know how it developed and, or in general, how you approach the instrument. And the second thing, which I'm curious to know, is you use FM synthesis
Mhm.
a lot. This is something that I don't, including myself, I don't see anyone else doing that. And I'm curious to know why you chose to use it. What do you benefit from it, or what? Maybe it's a sound or a concept thing, or maybe it's actually all together. I don't really know. So I'm curious to know your thoughts on it. So maybe let's start first with the flow. If there wasn't um, any way you went, you approached it.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me on, first of all. And
Pleasure.
I guess for me, um, that's nice of you to say. I love this instrument, you know. But the funny thing is, I bought one in like 2000, maybe eight, I think,
Mm-hmm.
something like that, maybe '07 or '08. I think it must have been after I was out of college because Bob Mincer was one of my teachers who you mentioned. He was my teacher for 3 out of 4 years of college in Manhattan School of Music, and he was always trying to get me to play the iwi. And you know, he had his iwi set up there, and sometimes in the lessons he'd be like, "Why don't you just try this for a second?" And I couldn't do anything on it, and I didn't have a concept or anything of what I would want that to sound like anyway.
Mm.
And when he left for Los Angeles, he gave some of his students some of his instruments, and I still have one of the Iwis that he gave me, one of the very first Akai 1000s, but it was kind of like in disrepair and it didn't really work right. So I kind of, you know, to try to get a handle and feel for it, I bought one, and I couldn't do anything with it. It was
Mm.
so difficult. It was one of the 4000s, and eventually I just sold it on eBay because I played saxophone mainly, and that was kind of all I was hearing at the time. But then several years later, I got into the music of Alan Holdsworth, and that
Right.
is what inspired me to take this instrument up because not only was he an amazing guitar player, but I mean, one of the most amazing ever, but he was kind of the only person to ever use that instrument called the syntax in a musical way, in my opinion. It just was like it's part of his identity, you know, and he played it like when I heard it, especially when he would use a breath controller in tandem with it, because a lot of times he was using a breath controller hooked up to his syntax and playing both at the same time,
Mm.
modulating something in the synthesizer with the air. And I had never heard anything like, first of all, the harmony that he came up with. He just had his own sort of harmonic, like encyclopedic book that he came up with, chords that no one else really ever used, stacks of different chords on top of each other. Super cool.
Mm.
But then on top of all that, the sounds and the way he was using the synthesizers, I don't think had really ever been done exactly like that before either. And I just got super inspired by it. And I bought another Iwi locally here in Brooklyn from this music store and just started going nuts with it. I couldn't not explore that realm. And
Mm.
so, um, but again, when I picked it up again, I was like equally as dejected as the first time. It's so different than the saxophone. If you're a sax player,
Right.
and you know, you can come at this thing from any woodwind instrument, it has different fingerings and flute, oboe, even a iwi mode, you know that. But for anyone who hasn't played one before, it's got a lot of different ways you can approach it. I like to turn it onto the sax fingerings. It helps me because that's where I'm coming from. But um, I just started practicing it, and kind of my, you could almost call it a problem, is that when I get really into something, it's like an unhealthy level almost of like obsession that I get into it with, whether it's whether it was the saxophone or making the mouthpieces, which is the other thing that I do, or
Right.
this. I just kind of get to the point where I was practicing it all night, and a lot of the day I would bring it on the road. Like if I was on the road, I still take it on the road. If I go out with a band where we're going to be doing a lot of traveling, have a lot of downtime, I'll bring it, because a lot of times you don't want to bother people when you're practicing, and this is another great way to kind of stay in shape when you're doing a month or month and a half of gigs, and you don't want to like lose your chops on sax or EWI, because this helps my sax playing a lot too, I find. I think this requires a lot more precision than the saxophone. None of the keys move, as you know, and they're a lot more sensitive. So
Mm.
I find, and we can talk more about that later if you want, but I find that it improves the accuracy of my saxophone playing. At first, it kind of detracted from it because it's so different that learning it made me kind of uncomfortable on the saxophone. But eventually, that evens out, and you can go back. I can go back and forth between either one, and it doesn't affect the other one
Mm.
at all. But I do find that this helps my sax playing, which is, and it also opened up, and that's part of, I guess, what made me so interested in playing it, is that the way this thing is organized with the octaves and the keys the way they are, it
Mm.
becomes more of a keyboard or guitar like instrument, in that everything is way more symmetrical. Because on saxophone or any acoustic instrument, you've usually got a limited range. Even on piano, technically there's a limited range, but on saxophone especially, unless you're really good getting into the altissimo range, there's like 2.5 octaves worth of notes on
Right.
it. So I think I have probably like 3 octaves and a third of range personally. I don't play much above high D on tenor, but so because of that, and because of the way stuff sounds on a sax, you're not going to play the same things that you would play in the low register in the altissimo range, or like
Right.
even the second octave. You kind of have a language, like any artists that were used to listening to Charlie Parker or Cannonball Adderley. They all have their own language and stuff that they've worked out that they play a lot in the ranges that are available on their instrument.
Mm-hmm.
But on this thing, you can literally play the same lick in any, or the same, musical melody in any range, and it'll sound cool. And so because of that, you wind up playing a lot more patternistically, which is kind of counterintuitive to the way I like to play, which is more melody based. But the point is, it opened up a whole new world of like things to practice, ways to practice, and also improv language. Like I had to develop a new way to sort of improvise for myself, because everything that you play on saxophone is kind of more bebop related, and that I still struggle with getting away from that on the iwi, because the iwi, like, when you play like cliche jazz bebop lines on a synth, it sounds kind of dumb. you know
Mm-hmm.
and a perfect example
Yeah.
of the opposite of that is either Alan Holdsworth, or, to me, the guy you mentioned earlier, Sean Wayland, who's a really good friend of mine, who I also look up to as like one of my favorite improvisers. I talk to him all the time. We're really good friends, and I've been lucky enough to play with him a lot, because not a lot of people know who he is, but he's an amazing composer and songwriter, and he's a really good singer and a really amazing keyboard player, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
And we've played together a lot, um, mainly just in his band. But we had this trio that you mentioned too, that basically just played gigs at bars and New York and on the road a little bit, but it's not something we've done a ton of. But anyway, though, those two guys in particular were huge influences for like my personal what I'm aiming at with this thing.
Mm,
Um, if you listen to Alan, those lines and the harmonies, I just don't think I've ever heard anything like it. And
I
I'm
agree.
not that much of a transcriber, so I never really sat down and figured most of it out. But I've picked up a few little things here and there, and mainly just tried to let it uh, come in by osmosis of listening to it like a lot, way too much. Um, and I feel like it's found its way sort of into some of the things that I've come up with. He also has a really amazing video. Alan was not good at explaining what he did, and I don't think he even totally knew exactly how to put it into words because there's that video that he has. You can find it, it's freely available now, where he has this chord chart of the entire neck of the guitar,
Mm-hmm.
which doesn't mean anything to me, but there are notes, that he puts on a staff that you can look at and talks about how he thinks about improvising with scales.
Right.
And most of what he describes is a lot more basic than the way he plays. So maybe he just didn't want to really even let out those secrets. I don't know. But he does explain some of it and like how he came up with some of the things that he uses all the time. And what the one thing that's really interesting about him, and I guess one thing I'm always working on to try to figure out how to get better at, because most of what I always played on the saxophone was really chromatic and bebop orientated. It's interesting to listen to Alan because the chords are so complex and they're all moving in a way that seems kind of unrelated sometimes, and but really flowing. But the funny thing is, if you really break it down and listen hard and slow it down, most of what he's playing is very diatonic if you relate it to the chord that's passing by at that particular moment. What I mean is he doesn't step outside of the scales a lot.
Mm,
So it kind of does make sense the way he explains his way of improvising. He always said that he didn't want to play bebop. He loved Charlie Parker, Coltrane, and all those guys, but he didn't want to be just another jazz bebop guitar player. And he achieved that, I think, by coming up with this totally other way of playing that was actually more based on scales, which sounds really unmusical. And he was one of the most musical guys, I think, just on the same level in a different way as those great jazz musicians, I think. Um, but he didn't, if you listen to it, it's like there's some patterns that step outside the changes and stuff like that. But when he's playing those really complex harmonies, a lot of times what he's playing is exactly what the chord is, just in scale form,
mm,
not really playing a lot of chromatic scales or like bebop stuff. And if you're coming at that way of playing music from a jazz bebop perspective, which I am, it's actually really hard to get out of that because it's easy kind of to play bebop, I think, at this point. Or maybe I've just been doing it a long time, but getting away from that and playing a little bit more linear
mm-hmm.
with the actual harmony that goes by and staying true to the scales and stuff and trying to make musical melodic content just with that limitation, it sounds a lot different and it's not what you're used to if you're a jazz musician. So it's actually that's one interesting thing about this instrument that has kept me interested in it past the initial like just learning of the instrument. It's more like what it leads you to musically is really cool. And but yeah, just as far as the flow and the technical end of it goes, that was the whole battle for me, and it still is keeping it up because you have to keep it up and practice it.
Right.
Um, is how it's a really difficult thing to play, but to me, if you put as much time into it as you do learning to play an acoustic instrument, which is
Mm,
probably why you would wind up playing one of these, is that you already play an acoustic instrument.
right.
I don't think it's really that different than learning to play the saxophone really well. It's just that because of the way it's built, you can play it a lot faster. So I'm kind of obsessed with speed and like doing patterns up and down the entire range of the instrument and scales and that kind of thing. And then when you kind of slow it down and play with a band, um, the speed is still there, so you can like float over the rhythm section if you want to, but you can just do so much with this instrument that you can't do with sax. So I guess I got kind of obsessed with practicing it, and the flowing improvisation thing is kind of, yeah, I feel less inhibited with this than I do with the saxophone, crazy enough. um I play with my brother a lot, and he was actually kind of noticing that it feels a little more free to me to improvise on this, which is a crazy thing to say because I've probably played the saxophone so much more
Hmm.
than this thing. I mean, I've had it decades longer than this. So,
Right.
but I don't know, for whatever reason, it just I feel really comfortable on it, and it. But all that being said, you still have to practice it a lot all the time to keep, as you know, because you're also an awesome iwi player. Uh,
Thank you.
it it's something you kind of have to maintain, just like the sax, if you want to
Right.
perform with it.
Was Alan Osworth the reason why you kind of went into FM synthesis? Maybe these sounds, that period of music?
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah, like so I had so my brother has a DX7, and
Oh yeah.
I mention him because we play together all the time, and he's an awesome piano player. And we went to this high school that was like an arts high school in Dallas, Texas. Um, it's got a long music history of people that went there, and because of that, they always had kind of like the cutting edge instruments at the time. But by the time we got there, like the Rhodes and the 90s and the early 2000s, like the Rhodes and the Junos and all the Roland and Yamaha synths that were there were just sort of in the storage unit. Like no one really used those,
Mm-hmm.
even though to me they sounded way better than the Phantoms and the Korg Tritons and stuff that people had convinced the faculty to buy at that time
Mm.
that we were using in the school. But they just kind of wanted to get rid of them. So they gave my brother a DX7, and my dad, who taught there, snagged a TX7 for me. And it was all, legit, like we were allowed to take it. But they were just going to throw it away, or maybe they even did throw it away. The point is, I just took it and I didn't really know what to do with it until I got into that Holdsworth tradition period. And when I was trying to figure out how they were making the sounds, I noticed that most of the time he and Steve Hunt, the keyboard player, were always using like either Oberheim synths from the 80s or the TX7 or the DX7, which is the same thing. The TX7, for those that aren't familiar, is a module. Mine's over there in a pile of stuff, or I'd grab it. But it's a module. It's about that big, and you can do everything with it that you can do with the DX7 except program. You can't program, but you can load patches onto it.
Mm.
So you can make a patch in like DXEd or whatever that program is. That's the software version,
Right.
and or whatever DX7 patches that you want. You can load it on there, and it sounds exactly the same as it would coming out of a DX7. So I have one from back then and one that I bought on Craigslist, and it was a rainy day project because there's no buttons on it, and programming an analog synth is a lot easier than programming a FM synth. As a matter of fact, I still feel like a total novice when I'm trying to come up with an FM patch. It's
Right.
mostly just sort of experimentation. But once you
Yeah.
figure out the basic way that it works, with a analog synth or an analog style VST, you basically just have a wave and you can turn it on or off. And then what you do with the wave is more like the modulation effects. And
Right.
so the way we do it on iwi, the most simple way to explain it is you just leave it on the whole time, and you set the ADSR envelope for the amp. However, that's a personal thing. I have the way that I like to set it up, which is totally different than like the way Seamus sets his up, for example.
Mm.
But then you're opening and closing the filter to turn the sound on and off. So
Right.
it's really simple. But with the FM synths, they all work a little bit differently, the ones that I've come across. And to explain it in a basic way, it's sine waves modulating each other. So you in the sine waves are called operators,
Mm-hmm.
and in an instrument like the DX7, for example, you've got 6 operators. So I didn't know any of that, and this box is just sitting there staring at me, and I could never figure out how to get it to work. And one of the reasons is in that box they call breath control foot control. So
Oh.
in terms of a modulation parameter, you'll either have the ability to map things directly with your DAW in a software form, or in hardware life. If you have a module, or let's say you have a big Oberheim Matrix 12 keyboard with MIDI in, you're never going to be able to control the filter unless it's either pre-mapped to aftertouch, or there's a modulation matrix, or the ability to map either in a mod matrix or in a DAW the breath control from your instrument, the MIDI breath, to the filter control. So then when you flip that over into FM world, a lot of times there's not a filter. Like I think there technically is a filter in a DX7, but I've never been able to find a use for it in a DX7. I can't make it modulate in a way that makes any sense with the
Right.
with the iwi, but I found another way to do it and get it to work. But the confusing thing was, and still is, that it's labeled differently than. So I just could never figure out like what was breath control until I started turning things on and off and just sort of messed with it until I figured out the thing that's labeled foot MIDI. I don't know what that is. Maybe some kind of a expression pedal
Mm-hmm.
is actually hooked up to CC number 2
Ah.
in a DX7. Likewise, Dexed or Dext, that software
Mm-hmm.
emulation of a DX7, which actually to me sounds great, which you can use to edit patches and send to the TX7, which is the way that I do it. Um, that also um, is labeled that way. So once I figured that out, then it was easy. But likewise, in one of my other favorite FM synthesizers, which is called Falcon, which is a software thing,
Oh yeah.
um, that also usually, actually, I can pull it up here and look, but usually although, okay, in this case, I guess it does sound better with a filter, but on Dext, I never used a filter because you can't really map it easily in Dext. And then when you do, I don't know if it's this way on the actual TX7. I never tried it, but it's like really steppy, like as
Mm.
opposed to like smooth on and off. So it
Right.
didn't really work for what
I
we're
see.
trying to do. So
Mm.
I just kind of left it off, and then to make the volume work, I used an operator and sent the MIDI breath to the amount of the operator.
Mm.
And then you can also either leave the operators that are modulating it, making the sound at a fixed volume or level, or you can also modulate those, which is cool. That's what's so cool about it. You can get all these different sounds. And the whole point of why I use it is that it sounds totally different. And to me, like really,
True.
like, yeah, I don't know. There's something emotional about it that doesn't come from analog synths. I guess it's those sounds from that day. They just remind me of being a kid, because that's like all the music on the radio and in
Mm.
movies was all 80s synth music,
Right.
so from probably like the Ninja Turtles soundtrack to,
Mm.
like, Alan Holdsworth. It all had DX7s all over it, even,
Right.
pop, rock, everything, all the bass lines and everything. So it has that vibe, and it's all digital, which is weird, but it's like super emotional, all those sounds to me.
Mm.
And so they kind of like bring up something, a feeling that I like. I'll say that to me it's harder to play those ones cleanly, because the envelopes in the DX7 have to be set a lot wider, a lot smoother than they do on most of the analog synths that I like. I
Mm-hmm.
don't really know why, but in order to get things to play like smoothly without glitches on the iwi, a lot of times I have to set my envelopes pretty high. And it makes this whole thing a lot easier when there's a little bit of like give or space in between the notes,
Mm-hmm.
so that the amp envelope is attacking and releasing a little bit slowly. I basically set it as slow as I can get it with the ability to still play fast and not have the sound go away because of the
Right.
rise and fall of each note.
Right.
And that makes it feel more like a sax to me.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, but to figure out how FM synthesis worked on iwi, I kind of had to figure it out myself because, like you said, there wasn't really anyone else that I could tell that was doing that. But you can definitely hear Alan is doing that. Like when he plays
For sure. I
on,
mean, I you mentioned it yourself, but you know, when I heard you on the TX7, my first thought was, yeah, that's Alan Orsworth. You know, that's like that sound. You know. Um, I guess also I can only imagine that Sean Wayland is also very much influenced from his music.
yeah,
What you guys do together, kind of, um, um, you know, gives that sound. Basically, creates that image of like, oh yeah, that's that Alan Orsworth sound.
yeah, he's
Um,
all about that. And he played gigs with Alan. He was
really?
maybe, I don't know how many, but he played a lot with Alan. Yeah, he has. I
Wow.
have some recordings of them playing together.
Yeah. I
Near
can
the
also when I hear his keys, I guess he programs the patches himself, but
yeah,
it's very very special what he does.
it
Um,
is. It is. He's an amazing programmer. For
yeah,
it's
yeah,
really remarkable.
I definitely noticed that, and I was kind of hoping to see more and to find more music of you guys together, and but maybe that's like a plan in the future. I don't know, but
Yeah.
I'll definitely tell you that I would be very much interested to hear you guys play more in that particular setting. You know, when he plays keys, you're an E-way drummer.
Hmm.
This is a it's I had some experience with B3 organs in Iwi,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, and I use I have like you the 5,000, the 4,000. I also have the 1,000, which is also a very very unique and raw, I would say, instrument to me.
Hmm.
But it has its own identity, its own color when you play it, and I think it sounds really really great.
Yeah.
Um, and so I recorded well, hopefully, I don't know if I'm gonna release it, but I had some experience recording in organ trio
Cool.
and Iwi, and it works great. There's something about left hand bass and Iwi, because again,
Yeah.
it's the same type of I don't know, frequencies, um, and so on. So it's great. I really hope you guys are gonna produce some more stuff in the future. I'll be curious to hear it.
Oh, thanks. I hope so too.
Yeah. Um, I also saw that you're playing the Prophet.
Yes. I so got one of those when I got really into the iwi. I didn't have, yeah, I don't think I had a fast enough computer really to do very much in software.
Mm-hmm.
And also I didn't know, still feel like I don't know anything about synthesis. So, but at that point, definitely really didn't. And like, so I needed something with knobs, to instead of just clicking around on the screen, it's just so much better to have knobs and a screen on the synth to like tell
Mm-hmm.
you what you're doing. So that was the only thing that was available at the time that I think that seemed like it would be a good bet. And I didn't have a chance to try one,
Mm.
but I called them on the phone. They're in California. Dave Smith's company. They're super cool company. I love.
I play the Evolver.
Yeah, right. Also, John Swana plays that, right?
Yeah,
The
as a matter of
Polyphone.
fact, I no, it's the Mono Evolver. But as a matter of fact, I got mine because I studied with John some time ago, and
Oh man, that
and
must have been.
when I saw him with this one, then I was like, oh, okay, I gotta get another one for myself.
I loved that thing because it was like, knobs right in front of you, and you could just with really nice quality encoders, and they were stepped, which was like if you know the difference between pots and switches. They weren't switches, but they were stepped encoders, and they had digital controls. So once you figured out what parameter control number that you liked on a certain setting, you could, of course, save it in the instrument, or you could just write it down and kind of remember it. It was awesome, you know, for
Mm.
that kind of for this kind of an instrument, having all that right in front of you and a screen and I think it was a four slot mod matrix on that one,
Mm-hmm.
which is more than enough for this. It was awesome. The reason I kind of moved on from it was more that I didn't love the tone, and
Mm.
something about the filters and envelopes. It wasn't as fat as I wanted. And
Mm.
the thing that I wound up with, I mean, it was cool that it was 8 voices. So a lot of times I'm using harmonizer programs, software harmonizers, and that kind of thing. Because it was 4 voices, usually it would rotate cleanly and it would
Mm-hmm.
work. There was never any drop notes with that machine.
Right.
Everything about like the functionality of it was like flawless.
Wow.
But the tone and the vibe, I don't think that particular synth has. I haven't heard the update. I know they came up with a new one, but I don't think that synth has the tone and the vibe of like the old Oberheim stuff. So I have this other thing that works sometimes. It's called the Oberheim Matrix 1000.
I own one.
Yeah, I'm sure you have. I'm sure you have this and many, many more of that, which is awesome. Uh,
Yeah.
but that thing is great. Mine buzzes a lot now, so I have to figure out what's wrong with the power supply and probably
Mm.
replace the power supply. But it really has a vibe. Really has a vibe. It's like super fat, old sounding, like, and also I feel really comfortable to play. Like it's a little slow. Like the computer end of it is a little slow compared to the Prophet. Felt really snappy and fast. But
Mm.
the thing is, it only had 6 voices, so usually I couldn't
Right.
use it with those software harmonizers. The voices wouldn't rotate correctly unless you had 2 of them. And my buddy Sean, again, we hooked them up together one time because he has one, and all of a sudden you have a 12 voice
Mm.
Matrix 1000 because it has that set into it that if you hook 2 of them up together and turn on this setting that it has, you can actually patch them together and create a 12 voice Matrix 1000,
Mm-hmm.
which is awesome. To me, I think I like it better the way it sounds in general because it's a completely different architecture than the Matrix 12.
Right.
But I think I like the way these sound better than that. I don't know why, but it's like there's something about the way the DCOs interact with the amp envelope and
Right.
the filter, which is stuck at 24 decibels per octave. It's not switchable. It sounds so classic. I love it.
Mm.
And just like comparing the raw tone of it to something like the Prophet '08, it has a lot more meat and
Mm.
a lot more vibe. So I kept that one and I use it sometimes, but mainly I'm on software. It just I feel like that stuff has like reached a certain level where it's like it's great, and I don't really want it to sound that different. I just use that stuff.
Any
It sounds
particular
awesome.
software that you recommend to use?
I really like this one called Falcon, which is not something super like popular because I think a lot of the issue is that they just don't offer a demo. So like you tell your friends, check
Mm.
out Falcon, and they're like, I don't want to spend $350 or whatever it is to like try this synth out,
Right.
which I understand. But I was able to secure a used license from someone that just didn't want it anymore. And so I got it cheaper, and they are cool with that, and they transferred it to me. And anyway, that one has, it's sort of like Dune, which is also
Mm-hmm.
one of my favorites, which has analog simulation, or what do you call that? Virtual analog, FM, wavetable, and sampling ability. And it also does granular synthesis
Mm.
and some other stuff. And then it's got a whole slew of effects. And now, interesting thing, they're shipping it with Pro Tools. So when you buy Pro Tools, UVI has some kind of a deal with Avid where they're sending it with the new Pro Tools. It didn't come with the one that I have,
Mm,
but now they're giving it away with Pro Tools, which is pretty cool. So that you have, Pro Tools basically is hilariously bare bones. When you spend all that money and buy Pro Tools for $600 or whatever, you basically get nothing for it. There's some plugins in there and that sort of thing, but unlike Logic, which has all these synth and effects, it never used to have anything. So that's probably why
right.
they licensed Falcon. But to me, I don't know, man. I If I just had that one synth, it would be probably enough. But of course, there's a lot of other ones that I like. To me, the FM section of Falcon is probably the best thing that there is for FM synth and the computer, other than Dext, which is Dext is tough because Dext is one of my favorites as well, but it's like really raw. Like there's
Mm,
not a pleasant user interface. It's hard to even figure out how to save a patch. Like, how do you even save a patch? It's really hard to figure out because it works like the files are organized like they were in the 80s with the DX7s. It's like you got to save it to a patch set, a 32 voice patch set, and then load that patch set on. It's hard to figure out how to modulate things. In Falcon, it's got its own system. They've all got their own system, like how they work and how you can modulate things, but
mm,
it's a lot more intuitive and it's in sections. So you've got your key group section, you got your oscillator section, you got your mapping section, you got your modulation section, and then under the hood of each one of those sections, there's all these options. And so the only thing that's weird about Falcon is it can do sampling and granular, but it doesn't come with any samples really. So you have to load those on. So I never really use it for sampling. But speaking of sampling, I really like Omnisphere. I
mm-hmm,
think that one is awesome. Even for it has a virtual analog section. And
mm,
there again, to me, that's also that guy, Eric Persing, I think is how you say his name, is like a genius. And he was behind a lot of the early Roland stuff. He's been a patch designer for a sound designer for a lot of companies over the years, and his company is called Spectrasonics, and they make
mm,
two really cool things. Well, three really cool things: the bass synth Trillion, the synthesizer Omnisphere, and now they have the keyboard thing, which I bought and love, called Keyscape, which
mm-hmm,
is to me the best sounding Fender Rhodes emulation in the box, in the
mm,
computer. But Omnisphere is right up there, and it's a lot simpler than most of the other synths, but because it's Eric Persing, he knows how to get things sounding better kind of than anything else with the way that he samples things. Is, who knows what he's doing, that's his secret, but he's just a really brilliant sound designer. And
mm,
so that one I love a lot for chords especially. But for solo patches, you can get some really unique things out of it that you can't do with other synths. You can like blend a Tibetan monk vocal with like a guitar acoustic nylon string or something, and like sounds awesome. So you can do all kinds of stuff with that you could probably come up with a solo Iwi album just with that synth, and it would be really cool. And then I
right.
like Dune. I think Dune, now they're on version 3 of Dune, is unbelievable, and they have the best distortion that I've heard on a synthesizer.
Mm,
The chorus and the distortion are two really important effects for me. I love chorus, and distortion is really hard to get it to work right on a synth. Like, but that one, the guy that programmed it, it works so amazingly well, and he has all these different algorithms in Dune for the distortion, and he has some new ones in Dune 3. There's a new chorus, and there's two new choruses, and there's one or two new distortions that he released with version 3.
mm,
And check those out because those are sick. Those are really, really happening. And Dune is not my favorite feeling synth to play for the Iwi. That's the biggest thing that varies with all of these to me is
mm,
the envelopes. Not as much the filter response as it is the amp envelope response.
right.
That one is not my favorite, but it's still really good. And it works really well. I think the very best one, as far as just raw and analog emulation,
Mm-hmm,
is Reactor for me. That one is and Reactor is more of a language or platform than it is just a synthesizer. It's not really just a synth. It's like, you know this, but for everyone else listening, Reactor is kind of its own world. And I wish I could program in it. I tried, I got partway through the manuals, but man, that's way over my head. I don't do computer coding or anything. And you really
Right.
have to be able to code to be able to come up with your own instruments. But one thing that I was able to do is they have a section of Reactor now called Blocks, which is meant to be kind of a digital emulation of what's that West Coast thing called modular synthesis? You know,
Mm-hmm.
so modular synthesis, you have all these hardware pieces, and mostly it's mono, but you can
Mm-hmm.
make poly versions of it. Likewise, in blocks, it's basically just built to be a mono synth. But there was this guy named Ken Kovacs in the user community that I found who uploaded some poly versions of the blocks. And I
Mm-hmm.
got in touch with him personally and just asked if he would make some 4 voice versions because he only did 2 voice versions.
Mm.
And I find that with the rotation, the way that I like to set it up with the amp envelopes, and it was kind of steppy. So with 4 voices with solo lines, you can still get a really smooth response. So he made that, and then I downloaded those and then saved each of the parts as an instrument because there was only maybe 4 or 5 patches that he came up with, and by patches I mean like an oscillator, a filter, an envelope, and the gates and that kind of thing. There was only a few different versions of those, and I wanted to be able to mix and match them, so I saved them all
Mm.
as instruments and reverse engineered how he tied them together, which is, you know, boneheadedly simple, but for me it took a while to figure that out. And Reactor is cool because you can, if you have instrument parts already, which is like meaning someone else has programmed that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that's the part that's open source. You can create your own, but you can also download sections of instruments and tie them together.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's an order and a process to the way that goes to get it to work correctly. And once it works correctly, then you actually have a synth patch, and you can
Mm.
alter the sound, get out of the editing mode and alter the sound on the screen like a regular synth, and then you save that as a synth. But the point is not to do all that complicated stuff and just have it, which is sort of a nerd blast. But the point is that it sounds more like a really high quality 70s, 80s analog synth
Mm.
than any of the other ones to me. It's like
Okay.
really hard to tell the difference. I did a test one day with my Matrix and the Prophet and Reactor, and I couldn't tell the difference. Just like on a raw wave, raw square wave with similar settings, no reverb, no effects, same MIDI file playing the same thing. I was going back and forth between them, trying to understand the differences, and that one I liked better than the Prophet. So,
Wow.
um, yeah, I find that one extremely useful when you just want a straight up raw analog tone. Um, and you know, the way that I use these things is like a lot more simple than the way a lot of other EW guys like their synth patches to sound. But I guess the thing is, I want the sound not to be the distract, like not to be what's super interesting about uh, the the playing. I want the playing to be interesting. And if you listen to Alan and Sean, who I just pick out of a heap of amazing synth players,
Mm-hmm.
those 2 particular guys, the patches were never really the interesting thing about it. Like they sound really cool and unique and individualistic, but they're not nearly as interesting as like some of the stuff just in terms of like synth programming, like Seamus Blake has, or you have, or any number of these other Judd Miller, or and I kind of like it to be almost like a sax tone or something, just like a really nice tone that
Mm-hmm.
you then play really interesting things with. So
Right.
yeah,
Interesting.
I don't know, it's a lot of rambling, but yeah.
No, it's interesting. I mean, again, it's this is like the point of view. You know how you observe certain things. It's interesting.